Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Gracie Northleet, member of the board of the World Justice Project, and it's my honor today to announce the panel that will hear from several experts on a very important theme. They're going to talk to us about freedom from influence, securing responsible independence of judges, legislators, and civil servants. The panel will be chaired by Professor Margaret Levi. She is the director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, US. So with you, Professor Levi shall introduce the other speakers.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I think this is an incredibly important panel, and I think you'll be really intrigued with what you're going to hear. I've been lucky enough to be in discussion with the participants over a couple of times, and there's some really major issues that we are all confronting. Government accountability is one of the major issues, one of the major pillars of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. And it is also arguably one of the major issues in rule of law itself. And in order to achieve government accountability, we need to ensure that those who are trying to make sure that government officials meet their responsibilities in terms of the laws and the Constitution, we need to make sure that those people are free from influences that could dissuade them from acting independently. And all of our panelists have been involved in that process in deep and important ways and are going to share some of their experiences with you. I'm just going to announce them in alphabetical order, but we're not going to speak in alphabetical order. So the first member of the panel, I'm going to give very brief introductions of people who have very lengthy experiences and important contributions. So please look them up on the web or in other ways. Mr. Rolf is the Director for Public Governance with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. He leads a team of 200 staff to support governments in improving their public sector performance for inclusive growth and the competitiveness of their economies. Key areas include institutional reform, innovation, transparency, and integrity in the public sector, results-oriented budgeting, and regulatory reform. Under his leadership, the Directorate pursues a program of cooperation with a wide range of non-member countries and is engaged with international institutions to advance the research on empirical evidence and good policy practices of public sector economics and governance. The Honorable Thuli Madonsela is the former public protector of the Republic of South Africa, serving as the head of this Chapter 9 institution for a 7-year term. She was just learning about her successor, too. I was overhearing that conversation. She was appointed as Public Protector South Africa by the President on the recommendation of Parliament, and it went into effect on October 15, 2009. At the time of her appointment, Advocate Madonsela was the only full-time commissioner in the South African Law Reform Commission, one of 11 technical experts that assisted the Constitutional Assembly in drafting South Africa's new constitution. Thuli is a human rights lawyer, equality expert, constitutional analyst, and policy specialist. The Honorable Willy Mutunga is the former Chief Justice of Kenya and a member of the Justice Leadership Group of Kenya. He played a pivotal role in the constitution-making processes in Kenya in the early 90s and again in some of the reforms in 2010. Under his tenure as Chief Justice from 2011 to 2016, Mutunga sought to lay permanent and indestructible foundations for the transformed judiciary. Under the blueprint of the Kenyan Judiciary Transformation Framework 2012 to 2016, he achieved impressive progress in bringing the justice system closer to ordinary people. Not only did he succeed in humanizing the Kenyan judicial systems, he also reduced the number of case backlogs significantly. He aimed to use technology as an enabler of justice, as well as to bring about equitable and transparent systems of recruitment, promotions, and training. He supported and strengthened the Judicial Training Institute as a nucleus for juristic training and an institution of higher learning. Mutunga is well known for his fight against corruption in the judiciary and in Kenya as a whole. He spearheaded independent and principled dialogue, consultation, and collaboration between the three arms of government. The Honorable Mansour is the Deputy Speaker, the Parliament of Senegal, and the Co-President, the World Council of Religions for Peace. He's been the Deputy Speaker since 2012. He serves on the Finance and Sustainable Development Committees. He is also co-president of the World Council of Religions for Peace. Mr. C is a religious leader of the Chani Sufi order in Senegal. He served at the Islamic Development for 27 years, retiring in 2006 as Deputy Director of the Technical Cooperation Office. Upon returning to Senegal, Mansour became active in politics to help improve the democratic outlook for the country. We are very lucky today. We're unlucky that the Ombudsman from the Philippines, who's on your program, was unable to join us because of an illness, of a health problem. But we are very pleased that Mr. Asryman Rafanan, who is the Assistant Ombudsman, was able to be here. So he is the Assistant Ombudsman for Legal Affairs at the Office of the Ombudsman in the Philippines. He has been designated as the spokesman of the Office of the Ombudsman 2011. He acted as the interim officer in charge of the Office of the Deputy Ombudsman for Luzon from February 2012 to May 2012. Assistant Ombudsman Rafanan is a member of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines and the International Bar Association. Now, I'm sure I didn't do a perfect job on any of your names, and my name is Margaret Levi. So all names are more or less pronounced right. You can give your names again as you start speaking so that we make sure they're on tape in the appropriate pronunciation. What we're going to do today is I am going to ask a multi-part question of each of them, of the panel, and give them only about 5 minutes each to respond. And then we are going to have a conversation among ourselves, and finally in the last 20 minutes or so of the session, if someone will signal to me when that is, we will turn to the audience for questions, okay? And we will try to call on some people who have not been called on before if we can. So they're all prepared for this question, but now let me give it to you as well. When we think about government accountability, obviously freedom from influence and independence and checks and balances are all part of that equation. So what I want to ask each of you is, what threats have you experienced to your independence? What are the sources of those threats? And how have you handled those threats? And as I explained to them, they will obviously answer only parts of those questions, and then hopefully we can elaborate in our question and answer. We'll start with Rolf.
Margaret, thank you very much. I have to say, when I walked here into this room, Margaret said, "Oh, here comes the bureaucrat." But I'm so delighted that around this panel we have been able to gathering really the branches of government and people who have a very wide-reaching and diverse experience. And I will just make 3 comments, really, to start with. The first one is simply to say freedom from influence is not an objective, at least in my view. It's not an objective in itself, it's a means to an end. And I think that freedom of influence is a fantastic ingredient for good performance. So we should look at it, how we can make freedom of influence part of an equation that in the end says the output, the performance, the outcome is superior than in cases where that would not be the case. So that's my first hypothesis. I'm happy to discuss it, but I think it's important that there is a context. The second remark simply is to say freedom of influence is not a partial issue in any system that I know of, which means we will have to look at the conditions, at the context, at the setup, even the constitutional setup, to have an idea about what freedom of influence really means and how it can work. I don't think that there are solutions possible for individual parts of government, for individual tasks of government. It will always come back to the question of how does government in the three branches actually operate, and what is the society's view on that type of operation. And by mean, just to sort of illustrate it, I think freedom of influence without transparency and accountability is not going to work. But there are other conditions, I don't want to go into it now, to make sure that, however, we not forget that I think these ideas of having freedom of influence in individual places, but lack very important ingredients for a functioning constitutional system would not really be realistic in my view. And the third point, Margaret, just to say that the organization that I represent and work for here today, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, many of you, I hope at least, will know about it. We're 35 industrialized countries. The main purpose of all the work we do in Paris about policy advice is to find solutions for what works. And when you talk about freedom from influence, we're trying to say, how does it have to be implemented? Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the practical levers of getting there? And here again, I will just say at the beginning of this discussion, we really think we will need to look not only at what I call external governance. What is the relationship of an institution to its partners? To the parliament, if you take a regulator, I'm saying a regulator, for example, of network industry, something very, very specific. You will have to think about the relationship, of course, to parliament, to the executive, no doubt about it. But there is also an issue of the internal governance. How is an institution run, organized, financed, to give it the means to be independent from influence? Thank you very much.
Perfect. Yeah.
Mansour.
Yes, thank you very much. I am very happy, delighted to be able to be associated in this space of sharing of experiences. But we have to conceptualize before we contextualize. And this kind of concept has been driven long ago, for example, by Locke in Great Britain and by Montesquieu, when Montesquieu was saying that the political freedom can only be achieved in moderate government. Anyone who has power has a tendency to abuse that power. In order not to abuse the power, it should be a natural inclination that power stops power. Everything would be lost if the same person with the same body is the one who exercises the three powers: the power to make the law, the power to implement the law, and the power to try or judge the crime and conflict. This was set long ago, but the implementation throughout the world, apart from the experience of the United States in the check and balance, in most of the country, it doesn't exist. It is not so in my country, in Senegal, where, taking it from the French system, the Fifth Republic, the President of the Republic is tremendously powerful. In Senegal, for example, although it is the legislative, it is the President who's nominating. It's not in the Constitution. He's nominating the President of the Parliament, the Bureau of the Parliament, the President of the Commission, and all these kind of things. And the only way, the condition for which he's doing it, he has the majority in the Parliament. The ruling party is the majority party in the Parliament. And now we are in the middle of the election campaign. I am coming just from Paris to make my meeting there for the diaspora. Yeah, you have here our candidate. We have two ladies and one man in the diaspora.
The voting is outside, though.
Yeah. And the only way now, the logo we are sending, never again to give the president or the executive or the ruling party the majority in the parliament. I was just, I took part to debate last week in Senegalese parliament. Because they have the majority, they broke the rule in the commission, in the committee, and also in the plenary session. So the experience I had is if you leave this kind of situation to go everywhere in the world, it's not going to be a lot of advancement for democracy. That's why I think and I believe I'm going to make campaign on these issues. For example, we have the Kenyan here. In the Kenyan parliament, I was there 2 weeks ago with the Kenyan parliament. We have a system in Senegal where it's called emergency procedure. When they have a law, they have to pass it very, very, very quickly. Procédures d'urgence. And I asked the president of Kenyan parliament, do you have procedure d'urgence or emergency procedure here in this country? He said, we used to have it, but it causes a civil war for 3 years because of the parliament, because of the election. When they have a law, they can't change the electoral procedure. They came to the parliament and changed it. But the people outside, they are against it. And he said to me, I have been here for the past 4 years. I never passed any law through emergency or urgency procedure. Therefore, we have to make some reform in the functioning of the parliament to make sure that that function, that majority can never be beneficial to the ruling party. I think that Germany, they have given the example. Angela Merkel is the prime minister, is a chancellor. She hasn't got the majority in the parliament, in the Bundestag. And also in Great Britain recently, they are in the hung parliament because the majority does not benefit from the present prime minister.
Thank you. Thuli.
Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues, and thank you for this opportunity to the World Justice Project. No one likes to be investigated, and certainly no one likes to be found wanting by an investigator, and very few of us are happy to make sure that they properly comply and do not complain about being investigated or found wanting. Think about a traffic officer. We don't really like them very much, unless I'm the only one here who thinks we don't like traffic officers that much. But we have to comply with whatever they ask us to do. The tendency among many of us, though, is to do several things to influence them. Some of us charm them. Some of us beg them. Others are bold enough to bribe them. And the rude ones or the rogue ones go on an attack. For the last 7 years, I found myself heading an institution that has a job similar to a traffic officer. I'm using a traffic officer because if we're thinking about independence of the judiciary, we're thinking in a context where we're thinking of the tree as political in terms of how government is structured, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. In South Africa, the wise people that thought about the Constitution and designed it included a Chapter 9 in the Constitution, which created administrative oversight bodies. Something unique, something very difficult to understand, because you know if you're a politician that you will defer to judges, even if you will accuse them of overreach, but you've become used to the idea that there is something called judicial scrutiny. Rarely today will we hear a president like the one in South Africa once did years ago during apartheid saying that judicial scrutiny is the work of the devil. But bring in an institution such as the public protector and have that institution tell a politician, you can't do this, you can't do that, or you must do this. and you must do that, it becomes difficult because it's a new institution, and for it to be given space, that means you have to reduce some of the space that has been taken by the three arms of government. And that's where my team and I found ourselves having to tell people not to do certain things and having to tell people to do certain things. And what were our powers? The power was to investigate wrongdoing by people exercising public power. And that could start with just a public servant being rude to you, as was the case once in the maintenance office, where somebody came to us and complained that the clerk of court was rude to them. And that is a matter we could investigate. To a point where a president overuses public resources for his personal gain against the rules, that we could do. Even when it comes to judges, we could investigate, or the institution still can investigate, certain administrative failures by the judiciary, including being unable to deliver decisions on time, or the possibility of, in the past, dockets disappearing between the police and the judiciary. As I indicated with the traffic officer, we don't like being investigated, and we have several defenses to that mechanism. That's exactly what happened to us. People had to find ways sometimes to defend themselves against us. And where would those influencing factors or attempts to influence us to undermine independence come from? I would say the first place, though, we must look at ourselves. And when we're thinking about what could undermine judicial independence, or in this particular case, independence of an administrative scrutiny body such as the Public Protector, we think politicians, media, academics, and all other people who might want to influence you. But you may influence yourself, too, by having your own hidden biases. And one of the things I used to tell my team is, for example, we must accept that we're middle class, educated, and many of us former public servants. And obviously, when fellow public servants speak to us, the tendency is to believe that they're right. When a complainant who comes already angry and having been victimized and attacks us, the tendency is to start from the position of mistrust. So that's your own hidden bias. And to be independent, to be unbiased, you've got to acknowledge those potential biases and extract yourself from those and make sure that those biases do not impact negatively on the outcome of your decisions. The team itself, independence from each other. If you're a public protector, it's a one-person commission, although you've got a staff of about 400 people under you. But it's very easy to be, yes, Mr. Minister. Makes your job easy. The team decides, you just sign. And you can sign as many reports as possible. But you have to listen to your team. In my case, I had to listen to the team. Sometimes we would debate literally from the previous night to the following morning, pulling all the laws we could find, all the facts we could find, until we could agree on something. So that's influence from your team. But it's important, though, again, to make sure that you canvass all of the views from the team. External influencing factors or threats to your independence, I would say the greatest threat in my case was the executive. It's the one arm of government that does most of the work. It's the most powerful arm of government in terms of money, resources, and people, and it's the one that executes decisions of government. And what were the kinds of threats? They were direct and indirect threats. The direct threats came from nefarious people who, I think, a deputy minister of defense started a rumor that I was a spy, a CIA spy. Well, a ridiculous rumor. The CIA, Mossad, and MI6 all together rolled in one place. It's a long story. But that's obviously, it does two things. One, it makes you self-censor yourself, because you don't want to make decisions that will confirm that you're out to get government. But secondly, it also puts you under in a defensive mode. So you instead of doing your work. I met a young person at breakfast this morning who said when he met me yesterday, he was shocked that how humble I am. That he expected a monster, or he expected somebody. He was disagreeing with his colleagues and saying, "You're wrong, it's not her, it's someone else." But part of that is people create that persona, which then forces you to try and always make sure that you make decisions that will make you likable. But in the end, you've got to be aware of those things. And what's your defense, again, is sticking to the law. So lastly, to say, what are the mechanisms for keeping your independence? The first thing is the legal framework, which in our case is the Constitution, which includes tenure and a guaranteed way of how you can be removed. It's an impeachment kind of solution. The second thing that also protects your independence is hiring somebody who knows what they're going to do based on experience. Again, that's provided for in the Constitution. And lastly, for me, it was a strategy of being transparent in terms of how the decisions are made and writing reports that are similar to judgments where it's easy for an outsider to be able to determine how you arrived at this decision. What happened? What should have happened? Is there a discrepancy between what happened and what should have happened? If there's a discrepancy, is it justifiable? If it's not justifiable, shall we call it improper conduct or maladministration? And if so, how are we going to fix it? Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Asryman. Asryman.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning to everyone. Thank you to the World Justice Project for granting the Philippine Ombudsman Office the opportunity to share with you the Philippine Experience. And I am honored and humbled to share the floor in representation of the Philippine Ombudsman with the eminent personalities in the field of rule of law. One crucial government agency that is usually confronted with the enormous challenge of fending off political pressure or undue influence is that of the Anti-Corruption Commission of a country. And an Anti-Corruption Commission or Ombudsman worth its salt should be able to be impervious to any form of undue influence. During the first few months of the Philippine Ombudsman in 2012, while she was investigating cases against the former president on the use of her intelligence fund. And at the same time, she was a vital witness in the impeachment trial of a sitting Chief Justice on the matter of looking into the undeclared multi-billion-dollar bank accounts. Around that time, a small box containing a hand grenade was found just outside the gates of her house. And during an interview, when asked about her reaction, she remarked, "It's part of the risk. If it's your time, it's your time." Sporting some sort of a fatalistic attitude. And these are just some of the examples of threats that confront the top officials of the Anti-Corruption Commission of the Philippines. And the Philippines is not new to these types of misfortunes in terms of having national leaders who have risen and fallen, so to speak. After the fall of the Marcos dictatorship in 1986, the framers of the Philippine Constitution were able to design or put in a constitutional mechanism to ensure that the Philippine Ombudsman would be able to be freely independent. And part of the design would include fiscal autonomy, meaning that the annual appropriations for the office shall be automatically and regularly released, meaning that the Congress cannot decrease or slash the budget of the Office of the Ombudsman. In fact, I heard one anecdote. The first Ombudsman, Conrado Vasquez, did not attend a single budget hearing. A budget hearing meaning a legislative parliamentary hearing to discuss the proposed budget of government agencies. And because the office is ensured that the worst thing that can happen is that your budget would be maintained. It may not be increased, but it would be maintained. They cannot decrease it. So that's one. Another constitutional mechanism is that of the vetting and appointment. The vetting of the Philippine Ombudsman is done by an independent constitutional body with membership coming from legislative, executive, and the private sector, and the retired justices, among others. And they're the ones who interview and submit a list of nominees to the president. The president cannot go beyond the list, and she's forced to appoint anyone from the list. So that would entail a vetting mechanism that would be free from direct interference from the president. And one, the Philippine Ombudsman is created by the Constitution. The implication is that it cannot be abolished by the legislature. It can only be done so by constitutional revision or constitutional amendment, which is more difficult than passing laws. And then the Ombudsman can only be removed through impeachment, just like the President, the Vice President, the members of the Supreme Court, and other constitutional commissions. Although he or she is appointed by the President, she is not under the disciplinary authority of the President after appointment. So he or she is and should not be. She's not and should not be beholden to the appointing authority. In fact, the Philippine Ombudsman Office has been able to convict one former president, President Estrada. And we've been prosecuting one former president, and we are now investigating the erstwhile president. And of course, we filed cases against the erstwhile vice president who ran for the presidency, but because of the expose, lost in that election.
Sounds like the Philippines and Brazil are competing for how many corrupt officials they can get.
Yeah. And right now we're prosecuting 3 incumbent senators who are under detention for non-bailable offenses, including 30 more members of the House of Representatives. So the built-in mechanism is one vital component that by constitutional design, government institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission should be able to withstand political pressure and be independent, impartial in discharging, in resolving administrative, criminal, or civil forfeiture cases against public officials.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Willy.
Thank you. In the Global South, what are called transformative constitutions deal with these threats, very, very, very directly, whether it's the issue of recruitment, whether it's the chapters on integrity and, and leadership, the way judges are disciplined. But in my in my own experience at the judiciary for 5 years, I realized the threats are always there, the executive, parliament, the opposition as well, that is the government in waiting, and the invisible government, that's what the World Economic Forum calls the illicit economy. The cartels, the traffickers and others. And that invisible government, I think, is very, 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 very important. Legitimate corporate interests, civil society interests, that's important. But the others that we haven't written a lot about. My independence in Kenya was challenged a lot by the community I come from. My community, my ethnic community, where there is a culture that the public office is ethnicized, and you're supposed to help your community in terms of infrastructure, jobs, etc. I did have a lot of problems with the executive or, parliament, mainly because the Constitution allows dialogue and consultation with the president and the speaker. And I used to tell them what the judiciary does and what it can do, and that I don't talk to judges; they have to decide. And that dialogue, helped a lot. But the community was pretty difficult. Then you have also to watch in terms of threats that are close to home, family, and friends. There are a lot of examples in the judiciary where hard-working judicial officers, very incorruptible, were compromised by their spouses or sons. And that happens with the presidents also, right? Yeah. It's very common. You might have a president who doesn't know that the son is selling access to him or to her and compromising that independence. So in my case, I had to talk to my family, to my friends, talk to the community. When the community send delegations, I'll tell them I'm Chief Justice of all Kenyans, not the community. And they will tell me, well, when you get into trouble, don't come to us. And I said, fine, I'm not going to come, to you. In terms of also independence, the institutions themselves can undermine their independence. Judicial culture and attitude is also, a problem. But I think the best, in my view, the best guarantee of, our independence as public officers, as presidents, as speakers, and it's actually the public confidence. How you build public confidence, in the institution, because it's the public that can defend that, and it's the public that needs to be convinced that the decisions we come up with are free, from the various influences that they are very aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up on Willy's last point there and throw it out to everybody, because what you're really raising, what several of you have really been raising, have to do with how do we ensure the legitimacy as well as the accountability of government, right? How do we ensure that even if there is corruption, as in Brazil or in the Philippines, that people believe in the government and that it will have resources to correct those things? And your answer is that part of that is building up public confidence. But there's so many publics, as you yourself said. You, Mansour, were talking about, you're worried about the party and the Congress being so aligned that there's no space for the minority, right? Or for other voices. You're talking about, Willy, ethnic communities which have literally been at war with each other at times, and certainly in conflict with each other, even when they're not physically fighting. The Philippines does not have one community, right? Yeah. There are multiple communities there. So how do you build that kind of public confidence, and how do you use your institutions to do that?
I can talk about my experience in South Africa as public protector. Public engagement is important, and transparency in terms of the decision-making process. What Willy says is something that we did too. We would have stakeholder engagements. We visit villages and we talk them about what we do, how we do it, and why we do things that way. Even this narrative about what happened, what should have happened, is there a discrepancy between the two? We would discuss that narrative in all 11 official languages. And in the end, when there were attacks, where it was said, you are doing wrong things, you are targeting the governing party, it would be an ordinary grandmother in a village, the ordinary Gogo Dlamini, as I would call her, who comes to our defense to say, but what she did to this one is exactly the same thing that she did to that one, and we didn't complain because the criteria is the same. So that public narrative and engaging everyone, making sure that everyone understands the principles helps.
So the issue there is really demonstrating due process, and that there really is a procedure that's being followed, and that people can reconstruct it and understand it.
Keeping on reminding them, for example, with me, when I dealt with ethics and abuse of executive privileges, I would, in the public narrative, I would remind them of which was the first case that we did, what were the principles, what was the outcome. The second case that we did, what were the principles, what was the outcomes in this one, so that they can understand that the one who's saying they're being targeted is lying, because the principles we're applying are exactly the same as we have applied them in the last 7 years.
Anybody else want to come into that?
Yeah.
Please, go
go ahead.
You see, when I listen to these very passionate experience that exist in countries, I still would maintain that one of the difficulties of talking about freedom of influence goes back to, Margaret, what you're saying. That's also a question of the freedom of influence from whom and for whom. So when you have the multiple publics that societies just consist of, in various degrees and according to different criteria, then it depends a bit on what you consider as the one who is either affected or participating or acting, or what you would call an influence, an undue influence. Because influence by itself, that's part of policies. And politics certainly is about influence.
Absolutely.
The question is to what extent it is illegitimate or undue. And I think the definitions and the practices in the countries differ quite a bit on what you consider an influence that is undue. And let me just say, you see, let's say it's a more recent, really, sort of discovery that money makes such a difference, not just in terms of payments. It's not an issue of a bribe to give someone money, to hand backs of money. Influence in terms of economic advantage can take many, many, many different formats. And to discover them, there helps a lot transparency, due process, I think it's true. But it also requires an understanding of how this influence is exercised and can be exercised today. I mean, in concrete terms, an influence, an undue influence, can have something to do with how do you organize procurement in a government.
Right.
You know? I know when we talk about procurement, many people think it's sort of really a boring subject, but it's 15% of GDP, 30% of budget expenditures in the countries that I work for. 30%. The way you hand out your procurement, your contracts, visibly or invisibly, may be the result of undue influence. The point that I'm trying to make here is, I'm delighted that this issue of undue influence has risen so strongly to the attention, and that we today have the discussion about it here is testimony to the relevance of the functioning of democracies, but I would say also of economies. Yep. To function properly, you need to be very much aware of what is happening. And let me repeat it. Freedom of information, freedom from influence, freedom to have access to transparent process. That means really that we are not talking about a status that is not changing. We have to put it, you said it, Mansour, it's the context. And the context, I think, has changed quite a bit.
It has.
It has changed within countries, within societies, but also across.
Globally.
Across. So it's a living subject. It requires discussion. I don't think that any of us here, including the audience, would be able to stand up and say, but we have a fantastic model. Please come by and sign up. I can give you the ultimate advice on it. It requires research, of course, analysis, but it also requires debate. And I would like to say participation, Madam, is something that I believe is an incredibly important ingredient. Participation, because once people see what's going on there, then there is a different way of looking at the same issue. I conclude by, again, practical example. For most people, public budgets is something that they don't understand. Not because they don't want to, but they just don't invest and they don't have the means in many cases. When you look at example where participatory budgeting takes place at local level, about very, very concrete things. You build something here or there. You spend something on the kindergarten or you print it. The moment where you go to that level of participatory process, you not only make people aware of influence, but I think you also sharpen the minds around what is undue, what is not an influence that we would like to...
But I have to push back on that a little bit, and then I'll let you in. Because participatory budgeting, which some of my students have studied quite carefully, can also be a source of undue influence, because it depends who participates and whether you can get enough people participating and participating in a way that matters. So I think even that, you know, that is not, there are no simple solutions yet, and there's no, as you were saying, I'm agreeing with that.
No, I wouldn't say these are sort of ideal solutions. No, it's just that I'm trying to say there are people are testing. I mean, there's a search for something. No?
There's an exploration going on which is incredibly exciting, and that needs to be encouraged. Mansour, and then I feel Willy wants to say something over here.
To notice how all these concepts are very ancient and antique. You know, Mandela was a freedom fighter, but he did not learn freedom or justice or equality. He didn't learn them in the Karl Marx books or Tocqueville, etc. He learned them in the Bible, in the missionary school at the end of the 19th century. and I am a Muslim, I am a religious leader, I am always amazed to see how many times the Quran was insisting, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلُنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانِ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. All the prophet I have been sending, this is a God talking, all the prophet I have been sending is only to make justice prevail. I send the prophet, I send them books also, I send them balance, a kind of measurement, a kind of balance, in order to measure, in order to make justice prevail between human beings. And the Prophet ﷺ was saying that God never refused the prayer of a just imam. And when you're talking about a just imam, it's not only the imam of the mosque, it's the leader of a political party, it's the president of the republic, even the head of any company. But yet, the difficulty is putting them into practice. And to come back to the integrity of the civil servant, recently, the president of Senegal decided that the people, the director of Inland Revenue, the director of the custom offices, the director of land management in our country, they should be joining his party and run the election, the MP election, the parliamentary election. And if they fail, he's going to sack them. This is a tremendous pressure, the lack of influence. Another example in Senegal also. There was one judge who resigned. We have in Senegal a body called the High Council for Judges or Magistrate. It is run, chaired by the President of the Republic. The Vice President is the Ministry of Justice. And one of the judges said, I have to resign because there is no independence, there is no transparency in the way you nominated the judges. There's no transparency in the way you manage the career of the judges, so I cannot accept. And you have some cases, present cases, for example, the mayor of Dakar is in prison. And the mayor of Dakar is the main opponent of the president regime. The main opponent for this coming election, the legislative election, the main opponent for the presidential election for the 2 years to come. So you have some cases where the pressure of the executive is so tremendous, you cannot anymore guarantee no transparency, no independence for the civil servant or the judge or the parliamentarian to do their work.
Asryman, you wanted to get in there and then Thuli.
Yeah, I'd like to delve into the issue of public perception, which you mentioned a while ago. That public perception is indeed a hallmark of impartiality and independence. And in a country like the Philippines, with 7,100 islands and a population of 110 million, it is imperative that you impress upon them that the Ombudsman, just like any other judge, should not just be impartial. You know, the familiar notion that judges should not just be impartial, but should also appear as impartial. So there are contextual circumstances that would very much remind the Ombudsman or any other Ombudsman official to adhere to that impartiality. One instance is that the Ombudsman should not be seen as waltzing, literally or figuratively, with the political branches of the government. I recall one narrative about an incumbent senator having been seen with a drug lord. And you know the drug war on the Philippines, right? And it was one of the pieces of evidence presented against that senator with the picture beside a drug lord, which might seem innocuous at first instance, but it precisely makes that point, to say no to those networking opportunities. In certain occasions, coordination, interagency coordination, especially in the aspect of corruption prevention, function of the office. You get to deal with a lot of public officials in instilling corrective measures, preventive measures. And these same public officials are the ones you're running after if they commit misdemeanors and misdeeds. So you wear different hats, and that becomes a predicament for an anti-corruption commission. You'd be dealing, coordinating, handling projects and programs, anti-corruption programs with various public officials, and then the next day, you're filing cases against them. So, but I hasten to add, but in the Philippines, there are different departments or bureaus doing that. So in those different functions, I think the integrity, the credibility of the office matters. And that can be seen by the issuance of various decisions. Just like what the Ombudsman has been telling, we go by the evidence. We do not just decide cases based on the clamor of the public in this era of populism. Or just we don't decide cases just to meet social expectations.
Right.
Because that can be very dangerous. It becomes an unconscious and an unwitting self-limiting threat to one's independence and freedom from influence if you get swayed by the cry of the throng.
Right.
So you make sure that in issuing decisions, the decisions speak for themselves without fear or favor or without any partisan considerations. You might indict public officials from the majority, from the minority. You can exonerate public officials from the majority and from the minority. And I think that's a very important thing that the people should see to enable them to have that public perception of freedom from independence.
So you wanted to get in here, and then unless Willy has something to say, we will open it up for questions from the audience.
I was just...
Well,
sorry. Okay.
Did you want to?
I just want, yes, thank you, Mickey. I wanted just a quick response to the colleague about religion. I'm a Christian, and I've always been very open about my religion. And as a result, the fellow Christians have embraced me, but I also embrace other religions. But you have to be careful about the role of religion in terms of undermining your independence, or at least keeping an open mind when you're dealing with a matter. I recall when I was the full-time commissioner in the Law Reform Commission, one of the investigations we had to do was on the possibility of legalizing or at least decriminalizing sex work. And of course, fellow Christians expected that the approach I would take would be sex work is criminal, it's a sin, blah, 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 and came over and wanted to pray for us, and I allowed them to pray for the event. But at the end of the day, the approach was to make sure you keep an open mind, that it is a human rights issue at this stage. It is not a religious issue. I just wanted to say that it's extremely important to keep religion at bay.
On this very important point.
But can I just finish there? A related point to that is also that threats are not always people insulting you or threatening to kill you, or in my case, also calling me a spy. Threats also, I think, independence or undue influence. I like undue influence because to keep an open mind, we should allow ourselves to be influenced properly.
Right.
So that we make a decision having listened to everyone, integrated their thoughts. But undue influence can come also in the form of being charmed. And if you like freebies, if you like free things, and if you like praise or you like approval, you may find yourself sucked into a group. I know as a public protector, by the time I retired, I had received about 60 awards And of course, everyone awards you because they think you're doing a good thing based on their own vision of life. But you have to be careful not to be sucked into any particular group's vision of life. Thank you.
I think Mansour gets to respond to you, and then we'll end with Willy.
Yeah, I just want to remind you that I am the co-president of World Religion for Peace. We can say World Religion for Justice. And you have 16 religions around the table. And what is important is what we have in common and not what we have in difference. And justice. In religion, the concept of justice in religion is part of the human culture. So we cannot get rid of it.
But there is a continuing question that's in all of our countries about the undue influence of religious organizations, whatever they are. And it's something we all have to be concerned with, just as we have to be concerned about the undue influence of money and the undue influence of powerful others in the society or celebrities. So it is another factor, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on this issue of perception. In a country, in countries where politics is organized around divisions, whether it's ethnicity, religion, clan, generation, gender, it's very, 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 very difficult also to talk about independence when the decision you make is actually judged via ethnic lenses, for example, or via religious lenses, or via gender or generation. So I think for speaking about my own country, I think the struggle for independence of the judiciary is an ongoing struggle, and it has a lot to do with how our democracy develops and how our politics becomes politics of issues rather than divisions. Because even if you're the Pope or you are Solomon in Kenya, any political dispute, you can't convince anybody that you are independent, because they have already pigeonholed you. And although we try very hard to have what I called judicial proceedings as dialogue, where you tend to convince people that you lost because of A, B, C, D, but it's still a very difficult situation. And I think it's important for judiciaries to play a role in trying to weed out those perceptions. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions now. And again, let me remind you that there should be no speeches, but questions. And I will, as all moderators have been done, be asking for the question if there begins to be a speech. I see someone back there and then someone up here. If you just wait for the microphones first. The first microphone went to the man behind him. Sorry, he was, yeah.
Okay. My name is Hashmat from Afghanistan. Thank you, panel, for your nice comments and your speeches. And
can you tell us where you're from as well?
Afghanistan.
Thank you.
And I had this stupid question in my mind from the beginning of this discussion that, well, we're talking about the procedural influence in all the governments or countries, and it's all about judges or any public servants. And I was wondering if there is any response for if you're influenced, if there is an influence by the ideology or a school of thoughts that you're following. And mostly I'm saying that whether it could be an religious school of thought or ideology or non-religious. An example I could give that in France, the judge said that the Muslims cannot wear scarves in the public institutions. And that is something that he or she is influenced by the ideology he's following. Or President Trump says that We are not in the Paris Pact anymore because we don't think we are not polluting the environment. So again, it's something that he is influenced by the school of thought that he's following. And I was wondering if there is any response for that, how we can prevent that influence. Thank you.
So this is a question about the influence of the particular ideology by which political actors are operating. Anybody have a response?
Speaking for myself, I would say that the only way you can try and limit that influence, I don't think you can eliminate it. I'm sure the Chief Justice, the Justices can confirm that, is by at least being clear about what are the rules we're using to judge. In our case, I said it was what happened firstly, that would be the factual inquiry. What should have happened, then we have to look at what is guiding us in terms of the rules that should apply. It's the Constitution. If you're taking the issue of a scarf, you would say, what does the Constitution say? What do the laws say? And in addition to that, what do universal principles such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights say? And the combination of those then we use to judge. I don't think it's entirely possible to eliminate personal biases. If I were to reflect on what former Chief Justice Marshall has said, we all carry our biases because of where we were born, who influenced us, our church, our parents, the people we played with, and the TV we watched. But we just have to at least be aware of our biases and keep asking ourselves questions. Am I making this decision because I'm influenced by my Christianity or my other religion, whatever the religion may be? And if I were not Christian, how would I make this decision?
So one issue that I think the young man raised had to do with personal bias, and you've responded to that. But the other had to do with institutionalized bias. So it's not just the question of deciding about the Paris Climate Accords, but also the issue of France and other countries which have institutionalized certain rules about what it means to be a citizen and how you operate that are not about personal bias. It would be following the rules. That's what they're doing. So is that something we should be concerned about? Is that's an influence embedded in the Constitution and agreed to in principle by the publics?
I just like to say that we have also to contextualize here.
Absolutely.
We have a big country like France. France is the country of the ideology since 1789. And still we have a president winning election by saying that there's no left, no right. There's no ideology. So I don't see anymore the relevance of the prophet of dead ideas. I mean, of ideology. You see people like Daesh, they have been eliminated yesterday or the day before yesterday. They have been running that for more than 1 or 2 years. But then the resilience and the resistance of the whole international community against these phenomena is showing that sooner or later, no matter the amount of weapons you have, if the international community is against it, against all those dead ideas, they cannot prosper.
Why don't we go to the next question?
Can I add one short? On the matter of considerations of ideology, I think it depends on the branch of government you're in. Because if you're in the legislature, there's a certain leeway in entertaining different or competing interests as opposed to those working in the judiciary. I think legislators are there precisely to hear the prevailing ideology, the prevailing cultural motives or mores, and to discuss policy. But after discussing the ideology, debating, interpolating on the floor, these ideologies, these practices, and this transforms into law, And then the other branches of government has not that such wide discretion to consider ideology, because public policy has transformed into law. And the judicial or quasi-judicial branches are not in that business of entertaining ideology. I think the legislature part could do that, but the judiciary, the quasi-judicial branches of the government
And certainly
are
the
not supposed
executive
to
Yep.
consider those.
Okay, the next question.
I'm not sure if this is working. Okay, working, yeah. I fully agree with the...
Can you introduce yourself and
Sorry,
your country?
yeah. Coincidentally, I also come from Afghanistan originally, but I teach at a British university. My name is Ali Wardak. I fully agree with the panelists' view about the institutional aspects of freedom from influence. However, institutions do not operate in social and economic vacuums. Institutions operate in a social class. So to me, as I think one of the speakers alluded to this, the biggest threat to independence of rule of law institutions come from the capitalist class, from the very rich and from big corporations.
So is that your question?
No, my question is how to reduce the influence of the very rich and the capitalists, to use Marxist terminology, in saving rule of law institutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rolf, and then, did anybody else?
I think it's interesting that this question comes after we talk about ideology
Right.
first. But you see, what does make a decision not part of ideology? I think there is a competition with the evidence that you provide. I think there's something about evidence that we should not forget about. And the most important contribution that institutions can make to the debate, for example, the executive, could refer to what is the evidence for their decisions and be transparent about it. And I think that, for example, the academic community has a very important role to play when it comes to providing evidence. Well, let me say, I want to make that comment in this context here. When we talk about influence, it's really too broad as a concept if we cannot distinguish influence from undue influence. There's a large debate, for example, in many of the countries about the profession of lobbying. And typically when you raise just the expression of lobbying, you have everybody telling, mostly at least, that this is really awful that they exist, the lobbyists. But you know, there are also providers of information. And it may be a fine line to walk between evidence that you can bring because you are actually an expert, you have a technical point to make, and you can have influence that is based on a pure interest-based proposal. So we are, and maybe that's one of the advantages of such a debate here, we are in the business of getting a bit more nuanced. It is not freedom from influence as such, it is freedom from undue influence. And that is nothing where I would say there is a simple answer to that. But it remains important that we see what evidence is provided. And let me make this very clear here in this room when we talk about the World Justice Project. Many years ago when you started it, Jim, when we started talking about this, I realized that there was a type of evidence produced that would be very interesting for the countries of the OECD. Others as well, of course. But I'm talking about this perspective. And we looked at it. And we said, this is worthwhile to be provided as evidence. What is the state of the judicial systems in countries around the world? That's an evidence-based, very important information. Many people use it. I have been very fortunate to get to know this project early on. We have worked together, and today it is part of the evidence that I think an organization like ours needs to provide. But believe me, having said that, it doesn't mean that that evidence is undisputed, taken into account. There are people who have all kinds of comments on it. But then I'm saying influence that steers debate, provides information, and makes the political process transparent. Why and how a decision is taken is critically important.
So we have a combination here of the importance of information and evidence and assessing that, and that's also nuanced, as you were pointing out, with the lobbying. But there are also institutional arrangements, as we know, and you represent some of those institutions, but they morph. The capacity to influence keeps changing, and that's part of what I think your question is about. How do you deal with today's form of global capitalism or global fiscal financial influence? And again, this is an issue on the table for us to continue to explore and find new means to do that. Mansour, did you want to add to?
Yeah, I just want to add, you know, Obamacare. Obamacare is a good illustration of the, not the political, ideological,
Notice I'm not raising the United States.
but the commercial influence. Obamacare. They started with Hillary Clinton, tried to make it through, it doesn't work. Barack Obama came and make it happen. But against the interest, the commercial interest of the international pharmaceutical firm, a medical multinational. So now, it's not a question of Donald Trump against Barack Obama. It's, you know, opposite interests, commercial interests, fighting in this very field of medical, of medical care. It's a good example.
And there are tools. I think the question that you've asked there is extremely important around institutional bias, ideological bias, and you are saying evidence. But how we collect evidence can also be influenced by our biases.
Absolutely.
That's why I was quoting Justice Marshall, and also my team, to say to my team, we must be aware of our class biases and things like that. But there are tools currently that are used to help you to understand hidden biases and to embrace diversity. In South Africa, judges are trained, and I hope Judge Golston, it's still happening, they trained in social context awareness. That was something that was introduced as part of the new democracy, and when we were going to introduce the Equality Act, it was intensified, and social context awareness makes people aware of your hidden premises or unarticulated premises, how you are going to evaluate who do you believe immediately, who do you not believe based on your hidden biases. So, secondly, there are also tools at policy-making level for parliamentarians to look at how your policy is going to impact on each different group. Currently, I'm at Harvard at the moment in a program called Advanced Leadership Initiative, and each one of us has a project. My project is on social justice, and the project is about designing tools to look at social justice impact of policies that otherwise look neutral, but they would exclude maybe the majority of poor people, majority of women or rural people or children, etc. And those tools then help you to prevent unintended exclusions and inclusions. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions at the most. It's very dark out there. Ah, Bill. Thank you.
Terrific panel. Thank you all. When the panelists used...
Bill, you have to introduce yourself.
Sorry, Bill Newcomb from the U.S., from World Justice Project. When the panelists used the term transparency, do they mean that the public has the right to know about all of the sources of information and influence that come to a public official? It seems to me that freedom from undue influence has two parts. There's an extent to which a government system can regulate against it, but at the end of the day, the disinfectant may be the sunshine, if you will, the revelation as a complement to the regulation of undue influence. And I wonder if the panel agrees that it's hard to imagine a perfect system which would eliminate all forms of undue influence. If there is no such system, I'm not aware of one, maybe you are, then to what extent is it important that the system instill a discipline of revelation, of illumination, of public knowledge of what's going on, so that we can judge why how that member of legislature made this decision? Was she lobbied by a large corporation or a wealthy group? And we can judge the performance of our public officials based on that additional, I submit, important information. Is that a fair understanding of what you mean by a term I don't like, transparency? I prefer the term openness, because of course transparent is something you see right through, and we don't want to see through it. We want to see to it and know how decisions are made.
Great question.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. Okay, so why don't we just go down the group? One of you start, Mansour.
Please. No.
No? Willy will start. Willy's going to start.
I'll start. Again, as I said earlier, a lot of these constitutions that deal with these issues, very, 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 very clearly. What is saying the two aspects are important. And a lot of constitutions talk about robust public, participation, so that that information, is readily, available. They talk about, accountability, so that when judges are being recruited or officers are being recruited, there is a lot of that goes on, and also when you are serving, there is public participation, facilities for reporting, wrongdoing, and so forth. So I think there is, the constitution or the legal regime, but I agree with him that a lot of those legal regimes, we've got to breathe life into them. And that life comes from, public participation, and that's why I was talking about the confidence that institutions, have to build, and there are various ways of doing it. Some judiciaries go through what they call open days, where they're asked, questions. But I think there isn't, a perfect model. Right. And when we talked about ideology, I wanted to comment and say, independence is always tested, tested on a daily basis. And I think judiciaries become strong when they deal with cases where everybody wants somebody punished.
Right.
Whether politicians or people. I've seen that in the case of Kenya when people were accused of maybe terrorism. People assume that they have no rights and they have to be convicted and punished. But I think that's when the judiciary basically says, the scum of the earth, where the people you want hanged and not hurt, whether they are drug traffickers and so forth, they have rights, and the institution insists on them, those rights being respected, because you can have a situation where the mob as it were, forces institutions to make the wrong decisions. So those traits are, I think are very critical.
And your example, I think, raises the tension about openness, in a sense, that you want the public to be able to understand how decisions were made, how people were influenced correctly or incorrectly, provided evidence or unduly influenced. But on the other hand, you don't want them to be, things to be so open that you can't make careful, deliberative decisions that need to be done sometimes in private and with negotiations of various kinds, and then reveal the process somewhat later.
That's true.
That got Mansour going.
For me, openness or transparency, pro-openness or pro-transparency, it doesn't matter. I give you an example in Senegal. Recently, oil and gas has been discovered. France is the former colonial power. Never believe that you have oil and gas in Senegal. The Americans believe in, they came and make, exploration and found gas and oil. Now the France want to come into the picture. All of a sudden, we saw Total, the oil multinational, into the picture. All of a sudden, we see that the Minister of Energy has been sacked. We don't know what happened during the negotiation. He was not been replaced. And his responsibility has been assumed now by the Prime Minister. It was very easy to take anybody else to replace him, but he didn't replace. So we have a kind of opacity, lack of transparency, lack of openness. Me as a parliamentarian, I want to know what happened, in order to be able to control the work of the executive and to evaluate the public policy. But I don't have this information. I am a parliamentarian. I should be the first one to know. I don't know what they are hiding between the president and the prime minister, why they sacked the Ministry of Energy, what happened. We need, not for me as a parliamentarian, but the citizens should know these kind of things. So transparency, openness, it doesn't matter. It's a semantic word. But what I want to know is what really happened.
I've never considered whether there's a difference between openness and transparency, though, and thank you for raising that. And I suspect that the architects of South Africa's democracy wanted to make sure that both are in the Constitution. As part of our founding values in Chapter 1 of the Constitution, we have both openness and transparency. And I agree with you that it's important, as my colleague is saying, it's important that people get to know what happened and why. Whether we're going to call it openness or transparency, it's the content really that matters. And if openness is going to give us the content, then that's fine. But I think the point you're raising is what one American judge said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And clearly in South Africa, we've seen that when at least people know what's happening, why is it happening, and how it's going to impact on their lives, they are empowered to act in a manner that protects their own interests. If they can't relate what's happening to their own interests, it becomes difficult for people to engage meaningfully. So to that extent, I would say that in South Africa we have these provisions, but human nature will always get in the way. Even if you have a good constitution, as we do have, people will still find a way to include some opaqueness or give you a semblance of transparency whilst they're not being open about certain things. But I do like what you're saying, that we should find a way to make sure that when a law is being passed, we know what led to it. And in Parliament, for example, in South Africa, we know who has provided all of the submissions. But when it comes to policy making in the executive, we don't always know where did things come from. We've just heard, for example, the mining charter right now come with a very strange provision when it comes to black empowerment. The idea of black empowerment was about compensating for imbalances of the past that were caused by unjust policies. Because if you now treat people the same when they are unequal, the inequalities will exacerbate it. It's mathematical. It's just clear that is going. But a provision just came into being that now says even people who were not South Africans at the time of independence should be part of the people to be compensated. And all of us are baffled. Compensated for what? If you were in India during apartheid or somewhere else in the world, you were not a victim of apartheid and therefore you were not disadvantaged by apartheid. Why should we now compensate you? And a provision of transparency that tells us why is this provision now being made? Who is it compensating for what? It would help. Thank you.
I think we actually ought to have to close. I mean, and let sunshine be a disinfectant and give people a chance for a break and coffee. But I want to thank this great panel, and it sounds like the discussion will continue. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.